The third factor in that collapse that year was the Federal Reserve, reaping some mischief again after having adopted an accommodating policy in the mid-30s following that contraction we talked about. Now in 37, they dramatically hike interest rates and help to choke off this budding economic recovery. But it's the Wagner Act, factor number 4, that really did us in 1937. It was formerly known as the National Labor Relations Act, and sometimes called Labor's Magna Carta. It gave us a new regime for handling labor disputes. It took them out of the ordinary courts of law and handed them over to a new agency we have to this day, the National Labor Relations Board. It gave organized labor enormous new powers to organize. This was the time of a wave of militancy among American labor unions. Sit-down strikes in places like Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, and the auto plants. The number of strike days, workers were on strike, from 1936 to 37, doubled from 14 million strike days in 36 to 28 million strike days in 1937. Dramatically raising the costs of labor. Some of the privileges that were bestowed upon unions were later chipped away by Congress, but this was a huge boost to organized labor and a very difficult thing to swallow for an already sick economy. The economy will limp along, still in depression, for several more years. 1939, 6 years after Roosevelt assumed office, his Treasury Secretary, Michael Blumenthal, gave a speech to a Democratic audience, which he recounted later in his diaries, in which he said, "We've tried all this spending, we've tried all these interventions, none of it is working." So when people tell me, "Oh, FDR saved us from the Depression," I say, "Hey, don't take my word for it. Don't take the numbers' word for it. Why don't you take his own Treasury Secretary's word for it?" They were frustrated that there was, only nascent recoveries nipped in the bud by further collapses 6 years into his term as president. Along comes World War II. You have still the feeling among many people that, well, that's what saved us. War is good for the economy. And I would caution people to not go down that path, because what makes war look like it can stimulate an economy is simply how it often is financed, through a dramatic expansion of money and credit, which only sets you up for a later correction down the road. We got a lot of that during World War II. But we also shipped 11 million overseas. That helped to reduce the unemployment rate. On the good side, the administration began to lower trade barriers, in part because we felt we had to trade with our partners in war, and that was helpful. But we really didn't have a sustained recovery that benefited ordinary consumers until after the war and after Roosevelt. It's not an exaggeration to say that the economy finally recovered when Roosevelt didn't. He died in 1945, and the Truman administration was much friendlier overall to business than was Franklin Roosevelt. You didn't have those diatribes in the White House condemning malefactors of great wealth and that sort of thing. Truman got rid of a lot of the radical New Dealers that had peppered the administration before him. And of course, you have this drastic reduction in government spending after the war, which actually helped to lift the private economy. So he who can look at this period, going back to the inflation of the 20s, followed by the contraction and mismanagement of the money supply, the jacking up of tariffs, the doubling of the income tax, the New Deal, the Wagner Act, all these other interventions, and still say, as the conventional history text tells us today, that the Great Depression was caused by the free market, and that the Roosevelt administration had to save us. He who can say that, I think, is woefully ill-informed and mistaken. With that, I'm happy to say I appreciate your being so attentive, and we'd be happy to take some questions.
I can't help but start off by asking the question, who is John Galt? But we'll leave that for another time. So, questions? We've got a few minutes for questions. If anybody wants to ask. Yes, sir.
I'm curious, you mentioned the work by Professor Rothbard, and I presume you studied under the great Thomas Semple in
Yes.
New York City. And a lot has been written about what you mentioned with the Federal Reserve's expansion of the money supply prior to the stock market crash and how there's been contraction. Because a lot's been written that what the Fed needs to do is to continue to expand the money supply. We talked about that, how a deflationary period will actually exacerbate the problem. Is that also though creates a problem? When does it end? When should a Fed expansionary policy end? Freeman has blamed the depression on that. It seems all mainstream economists agree to that, but what's the solution?
Yeah, I think it's a sad commentary, Mike, the state of discussion about proper monetary policy. Only lately, in the aftermath of this recent financial collapse, have you had questions raised that are getting some attention in the right places about fundamental monetary policy and whether or not the Fed is the source of our problem. I think that's a healthy direction to go in. If you look at what's happened since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and all the promises that were made at that time and in the years since about what this agency would do for us, they include things like, well, we need the Federal Reserve because it will provide just the right amount of money and credit. It will promote full employment. It will iron out the business cycle. The wizards at the Fed will know these things. They can centrally plan our money and credit system for them. But you look at the record, and what have we had since? We've had one Great Depression, and we've had 9 or 10 recessions, and we have a currency that's worth about a nickel of what it was worth when they started. Now, if we had said to a private company in 1913, hey, we're going to contract with you. We want you to be in charge of the nation's money supply. We want you to iron out the business cycle, provide just the right amount of money, and preserve the integrity of the currency. And if, looking back, that private company had that kind of a track record, I think we'd be prosecuting them. We'd be saying, hey, this was a bad deal, give us our money back. And yet today, most discussion about the Fed just revolves around, well, should we have maybe different people in it? Should we, we really need to get to basics and ask ourselves, can 7 people appointed by the president be trusted to know what the proper supply of a nation's money and credit ought to be? Would we do, if so, then why don't we do that with anything else? Why don't we have a green bean board? We could have 7 people picked by the president. They would decide what the supply of green beans ought to be for us. They could buy and sell green bean bonds. They could just be in charge of making sure they're just enough. Well, as a matter of fact, we don't have such things. We have markets, we have prices, we have private providers responding to market signals, and lo and behold, you never have to go into a grocery store and discover the shelves are empty of beans, or there are piles of them that don't get sold. Somehow just the right amount of green beans are there. The notion that you could have a handful of people know what interest rates should be, what the supply of money should be, that's at the source of our problems. We never get off this roller coaster because we never question the very existence of it.
How do you interpret and explain the collapse of the credit markets?
How do we interpret and explain the collapse of the credit markets last year? Several things. There are multiple culprits. At the core of it, and this is what really gave it its magnitude. It couldn't have happened to the degree that it did if it weren't for this. And that is, again, Federal Reserve policy was excessively accommodated for a far too long a period. They thought they knew what money growth should be, but after 9/11, they kept it too fast, too high for too long. And inflated, it produced an inflationary bubble that showed up primarily in real estate. And the big reason it showed up in real estate is because of other follies that you could lay at the doorstep, mostly of Congress, where they decided